St. John Bosco was an extraordinary individual. He was born to a farm family. His father had died when he was still quite young. His older brother, half brother, Anthony, was a real rough and tumble sort of individual who didn't have any use for book learning. But young John Bosco Giovanni was drawn to learning. He wanted to be a priest. He was also very athletic, though. He would actually do athletic feats and displays to get the neighborhood boys around so he could teach them their catechism. But he did actually wind up going, he became a priest. He was studying under his parish priest at first, and he went to the seminary. Even though they were quite poor, he was found to be quite gifted. And so there were those who were willing to support him to go to the seminary. And right away, you could tell that he was drawn to the personality be drawn to young people, and young people were drawn to him. The other boys pretty much looked up to him. And he was a natural leader. Even in the seminary, he was a natural leader. He had that inquisitiveness and the desire for learning, especially about the things of God. But he was also rough and tumble from the farm life. In fact, one day, even at the seminary, he found some of the boys pushing around, kind of intimidating some studious some young man. Remember, we're talking about teenagers here, okay? The young man was patiently putting up with this. When John Bosco came into the room, he saw what was going on, and he intervened, and he was ready to fight. He did not approve of this little gang of ruffians, as it were, intimidating Louis Comolo. And it was actually Louis who kind of had to prevent the fight because John was ready to take them all on. But he went on and he was ordained. And as a young priest, he took a special interest in you might call them feral children, the wild children, the wild children of the streets, who were actually orphaned by the wars of Napoleon and other just mercenary fighting going on in Europe at the time. There were a lot of children who were orphaned. Their parents could not afford them, or their parents were dead. And they roamed the streets. They survived in gangs. They would go through the trash looking for food to eat, or they would just steal. And they kind of terrorized the population a bit. One day, Don Bosco was entering the sacristy. He heard quite a ruckus going on. And the sacristan was chasing around a young lad named Bartholomew, who had sneaked in during cold weather and was just trying to stay warm. The sacristan found him and began chasing him with a broomstick, trying to drive him out. But the poor lad couldn't find the door that he originally come in. So he was darting about with this enraged sacristan, hot on his tail. And Don Bosco intervened, saved Bartholomew from the sacristan's broom, and had him promise that he would come back. And he did. He came back the next day. And that was the beginning of St. John Bosco's work with these boys. Up until then, he had tried to approach them in the streets, in their gangs, even as they were playing, but they stayed away from him. They did not trust him. They were regarded with a lot of suspicion and mistrust by the adults, and so they reciprocated and they shied away from any adult contact. So St. John Bosco was not really welcomed by them, into their circle, as it were. He was even warned to stay away from them, but he said he had a dream that the wolves would turn into lambs, okay? So he believed that it was a mission that he was on. And sure enough, Bartholomew and St. John Bosco, the young priest, formed a bond of trust and friendship. And Bartholomew began bringing his friends in, friends who at first would have been very mistrustful of a priest. But because of Bartholomew's trust, they themselves came to John Bosco and they began to have a real fondness for him, as he was very fond of them and wanting their good. Don Bosco became their advocate. Even while they were outside playing, you hear the thump of the ball they were using against the outside wall that would It got pretty aggravating for the other priests, and they complained to Don Bosco. Don Bosco, to him, it was music to his ears that they were doing that, something honest, something decent, and not out, indulging in mayhem or wreaking havoc. He finally had to purchase a piece of property and buy a half-submerged, I forget what it was some kind of farm structure in Baldocco. And there he kind of opened his first school. And he was personally training the boys in various things, making shoes, be cobblers. And he taught them various trades so that they could actually earn a living rather than just steal or scavenge. And more boys came until they outgrew Baldocco. And again, John Bosco found benefactors. God sent benefactors to help him work with these boys. And his influence grew and grew and grew until finally he was opening schools. He established the Salesian communities, which grew rapidly and devoted themselves to care for the children of the unfortunate. Then even to be caring for some of the children of some of the leading families of Italy. By the time St. John Bosco's life came to an end, he had thousands of boys under the tutelage of priests who he had formed. He had a religious congregation, and some of the boys he took in off the street went on to become priests and even bishops. He was sending missionaries out around the world to areas where other missionaries had tried but failed. Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego. He was sending missionaries to these places. So that's how rapidly, in the course of this one lifetime, the fruits were there, for that selfless labor there. St. John Bosco had a great devotion to our Blessed Mother, needless to say, especially under the title of Our Lady of Victory. He honored her and taught the boys to honor her. And so even those who were not friends of the church respected St. John Bosco, what he stood for and who he was as a priest, because he was really like the ideal of the priest. Not all priests were, and they respected that much. He once had a young man who had been in his school come to visit him, and the young man seemed very awkward. John Bosco knew there was something funny going on here. Well, the young man finally broke down. He had a pistol. He had come to kill Don Bosco. He had actually been commissioned by the Masons. He was the one designated by the Masons to come and kill Don Bosco. There were a number of attempts on Don Bosco's life by the heretics, Waldensians in Italy at the time, actually took shots at him. There would be holes in his casket, bullet holes in his cassock, but there were no wounds, curiously enough. But this young man who came to kill him couldn't do it. He asked Don Bosco's forgiveness, and he went his way, but he just couldn't kill him because, again, of that reverence he had for him. This is the kind of man St. John Bosco was. This is the kind of priest he was. So he was able, by that special sanctity that he had, to draw out of the boys their very best. Even if they had reason or narrow minds to be enemies of the church, they just saw something in him that was really of sanctity. But he always wanted to use that to try to draw them to the church and to God. He never tried to use the reverence that the boys had for him for his own advantage. He always tried to use it for their advantage. But he understood people very well. And he knew when one of his young priests could really help this young lad, perhaps even more than he himself, Don Bosco, could, then he would defer to that young priest and have that young priest handle it. He didn't claim all the glory for himself, not at all. He was always motivated by the spiritual good of all. So St. John Bosco knew exactly who he was dealing with by special grace from God, he was enabled to read souls. And because of his prayers for his boys, God protected them in a unique way, even if it were a matter of enlightening St. John Bosco about hidden sins that they would know. Remember all the stories that St. John Bosco would tell about the dreams he had about hell? Terrifying experiences. John Bosco understood the dangers the boys were in and could actually graphically portray to them dreams that he'd had that kept him awake he struggled with these throughout the night. He paid a great price for this, but the boys benefited from the warnings. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The boys were learning wisdom from gaining the fear of the Lord from St. John Bosco. There are so many stories about the life of St. John Bosco. You know, I think was it Pope Pius XI? He said that in the life of St. John Bosco, the supernatural seemed almost natural in his life because of the amazing things that he did. So he's an extraordinary man. We need another 10,000 saints like him.